Jeff, you can kick things off, and then Derek will be sure to let Sarah in.
Okay, sounds good. All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Welcome to our Nonprofit Advisory Board webinar today entitled Post-COVID Return to the Workplace, HR and Physical Office Considerations for Nonprofits and Associations. My name is Jeff Tenenbaum, Managing Partner at the Tenenbaum Law Group in Washington, D.C., and I will be your moderator for today's program. We have a terrific crowd today. From a wide variety of nonprofit organizations and associations to talk about what is clearly one of the hottest topics in the nonprofit and association communities right now, and an issue that our three panelists and myself deal with on a very daily basis. And so you are going to get some terrific information from three really talented, experienced professionals on the front lines of these issues, each coming from a slightly different perspective, which I think should round out for a terrific program here today. Frankly, our biggest challenge is that in the hour that we have, there's so much information to try to impart to you. We're going to have to do this in a fairly rapid fire manner, and this is going to be a very Q&A driven session. I have questions that I plan to pose to the panelists, but I encourage all of you who are participants today to pose questions using the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform, and I will pose those to our speakers as we go along. And our speakers know that we're going to try to keep these answers brief and concise, but also very substantive and comprehensive to try to give you as much good practical information as possible. Let me give very brief introductions of our speakers, and then we'll dive right in. So in alphabetical order, first we have Carrie Gabler. Carrie is Director of Business Development for Danker, an office furniture dealership with offices in New York, New Jersey, DC, and Maryland. Carrie started out in 2004 as a construction manager and relocation consultant, and then transitioned into the furniture world in 2008. Having been in a project management role, she understands the importance of all stakeholders, from end users, architects, brokers, general contractors, working together to ensure that each project is a success. Rebecca Humphrey is Executive Vice President at Savills and Workplace Practice Group Leader for Savills North America. The Workplace Practice Group at Savills specializes in a variety of service lines, including workplace analysis and strategy, wellness and sustainable programming, change and communications management, design and space planning, and space utilization and optimization. As you can tell, all issues that are very much top of mind for so many employers these days. Rebecca oversees all aspects of the group across the US and Canada as it helps clients address the ever-changing workplace, developing and deploying workplace strategies and processes that align with clients' business goals. And last but not least, Sarah Hensey is an HR consultant with TPO, a management and human resources consulting firm. Sarah has 20 plus years of experience in business operations, most of it focused on human resources. Her core expertise is in compliance, compensation and benefits planning, policy and procedure development, and training and staff development. Sarah has extensive experience in senior leadership roles in a wide variety of small and large organizations, including government contracting, technology firms, and more recently, nonprofits and associations. She's comfortable managing direct reports in large structured organizations, as well as collaborating with teams in matrixed organizations. So with that as background, we're going to kick right in. And why don't I, in no particular order, why don't I start out with Rebecca? And Rebecca, one question that I get a lot, and I'm sure all of us get a lot, is, and I know the answer depends on geography, and we do have folks from all across the country on this call, although I think we have more based in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area than anywhere else. But when do you think that a full-scale return to the office, whatever full-scale means, and we'll certainly be talking about that, based on what you're seeing from your clients and elsewhere, when do you expect that to happen?
Yeah, I think for a lot of organizations, it's already happening, quite honestly, specifically, and I would say in certain parts of the country, people have been back in the office for a while. Certainly, I would say the only states right now we see that haven't really aligned with the CDC as far as like masks and social distancing for, vaccinated folks are really like Baltimore and California. And so I think in other areas, we've been seeing a full scale return and we'll continue to see that grow. By and large, the date we're seeing for most people is like a range between July and Labor Day. That's kind of the most frequent official return date we're seeing from most of our clients and people we speak to. I'm hearing a little bit December or first quarter 2020, but I would say the majority is really like Labor Day for most people if they aren't already there.
Thank you, Rebecca. Sarah, follow-on question for you here. So as I know well, as an attorney advising associations and nonprofits on this stuff, and you as an HR consultant advising on a lot of the same issues, what sort of, and I know a lot of this is still a work in progress, and employers, including nonprofits, are trying to figure out what to do here, but do you see any trends in terms of, kind of post whatever that full return to the offices, say Labor Day for a lot of organizations? What sort of trends are you seeing in how employers are, especially in the nonprofit world, are revising or contemplating a revision of their remote work policies? Are you seeing any common trends or themes in this regard?
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations that thought they couldn't be remote now learn that they can. And so they're evaluating what return to work looks like. Is it swing space? Is it conference room space? Is it back to normal activity? Some of the groups, it's also very dependent on their ultimate, what their members or their, what their community needs. And so some of them have opened the doors right back up, and they're in there working, providing community support or other things. Some of the groups that are focused on conferences and other activities are a little slower to open. And I will say, I think one thing that's been important in those conversations with my clients, so many of them, the space that they have has been part of that conversation. Do they have the right kind of footprint and office outfitting to accommodate coming back safely and making their employees feel safe?
Well, that's actually a great lead, and I'm going to come back to you with some more on remote work policies, but it's a good lead in for Carrie. So Carrie, what sort of, in order to create a safe space for employees, and I know we're hearing that a lot from a lot of our clients, that a lot of senior management is kind of more ready to return to the office than a lot of the rank and file staff are, and we're still seeing, especially in the nonprofit world, a lot of concern from a lot of staff about returning to the office, still apprehension, despite where we are in the recovery and the pandemic, and a lot of concern about kind of what the office layout is going to be and how safe an environment it's going to be for staff. What sort of design considerations do you think should be taken into account when planning for a post-COVID return to the office?
I think the biggest driver is density, how close people are to each other. There was kind of a panic mode when this whole thing kicked off, where people were just buying acrylic screens and calling it a day. And that's just not a good long-term solution. There's got to be a holistic approach to design, which means, we're looking at the now, but we also need to, who knows what's going to come down the pike in 3 to 5 years. I'm not being a negative Nelly, but we've got a plan to have flexibility moving forward. It's always been a mantra within our industry to have that agile workspace, but this pandemic has been the litmus test for what that's going to mean, and having the opportunity to, once you invest in real estate, to be able to allow it to evolve based upon the needs. Other than that, I would say, from what I'm seeing, masks, my organization still requires masks regardless of vaccination. But at least in this particular situation, there was a lot about surface cleaning and things like that. But there's been, at least for this particular, type of pandemic, that's been proven not to have as much of an impact as respiratory. So before, we were seeing everyone removing things from their desk and putting in storage, like an uptick in personal storage, so that those surfaces could be cleaned every night. And some people are still doing that because of the hybrid office environment and sharing offices. But for the most part, it's not as much of a driver.
So are you, just to drill a little bit deeper there, are you seeing some of your clients reconfigure their offices now to try to create safer spaces, more distance? Like, tell us what some groups are doing. If the plexiglass dividers, the acrylic dividers between cubicles, isn't really the solution, what are some of the solutions?
Sure. I mean, honestly, I'm surprised. There is not a lot of shift from a design perspective. Initially, people were evaluating densities, but most of it is being, I guess, implemented just by offering a hybrid work environment where you've got people rotating so that there aren't as many people in the office and you're able to create personal space throughout. That's been what I've seen as the biggest way of approaching the solution.
Got it. Thank you, Rebecca. So following on that, tell us what you're seeing in terms of some of the specifics about kind of hybrid models. Are you seeing any trends, I've heard a lot about, some offices contemplating, 3 days in the office, 2 days out, and trying to rotate people so you don't have a full office at any one given time. What sort of trends like that are you seeing, and do you have any kind of best practices, even then, is it these very early days that you're seeing evolve?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the challenge with hybrid is it's a really wide spectrum. It's become this kind of term that people just, not that they use it as a throwaway, but just a very generalized term, hybrid. But what that means to each organization could vary quite significantly. You can have one company where that means everyone works 1 day from home, 4 days in the office. You can have another, organization where that means this entire department works from home forever, and these groups continue to go into the office, and then others where it's just a mix up. I think, what we see as far as trends in hybrids varies significantly organization to organization because it's so customized and specific to your culture and who you are and what you do as an organization. I would say from a best practices perspective, though, certainly the important, I'll say kind of guardrails or things that we want to make sure we're looking at in the planning process when you're thinking about hybrid are, we're seeing a lot of time spent on things like support spaces. So as an example, if you have a hybrid workforce, is your office set up in a way that supports that? If you're going to have a conference room where you have some people remote, some people in the office, do you have the technology set up in the space to allow for that to even happen? For people who are sitting out in a cube and previously everybody they worked with was in the office with them, but now they have people that they work with that are hybrid and they have private conversations. Do you have a small space, a phone booth or something like that they can go to take a conversation if they have hybrid people they're working with? So a lot of time spent on the support spaces to make sure people can actually do their job from a hybrid perspective, as well as the technology and tools, the software systems, seat selection, room booking, and things like that to allow hybrid to be a successful model.
Thank you. We have a question from one of our participants, and it's a question I get all the time, and I may take a moderator's privilege on occasion on when that is a legal question and answer some of these myself. But then you guys feel free to chime in. Is it legal to restrict what states your staff move to if we move to a hybrid model? I've heard some people saying that a number of employers are not allowing remote work from California. But I've also heard that you cannot restrict where people live if their job does not require in-person work. So we get this question a lot, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this too, Sarah. But the short answer from a legal perspective is that it is okay for you to say, you are allowed to remote work, from only the following states or from any state but California. A lot of nonprofits and associations are adopting that rule because having employees, so the way that the employment laws, and it's not just employment laws, it's tax laws and other things that kick in, business registration and licensing laws. California is a very burdensome state to have employees from an employer's perspective. It's a very employee-friendly state from an employment law perspective, but it's very burdensome from an employer perspective. And if wherever your employees are principally working, that's the employment laws, the state's employment laws that they are going to be governed by, regardless of where your headquarters is located. And so if you are an association or a nonprofit and you want to say, employees are allowed to work remotely, full-time, part-time, whatever your policy is going to be, or certain departments, but you can only remote work from any state but California, that is permissible for you to do. You are allowed to do that. And a number of organizations are doing that. You always have to be careful, and I'm dealing with a case right now for a client about dealing with potential discrimination issues. Someone making the claim, well, no, you're not just having a no California rule because it's too burdensome. You're really doing it because you're trying to discriminate me because of XYZ protected characteristics. That's always something you have to guard against and be careful about. In any sort of remote work policies, you need to make sure that they're objective and consistent and you're applying them on an objective and consistent basis. That also goes for the example that you gave earlier with, a policy that allows some departments to work full-time remote and others not. As long as you have a solid, reasonable, rational basis for having that rule, and as long as you're not applying it in some discriminatory, inconsistent manner, you can do that, and that's certainly permissible. Sarah, do you have any kind of follow-up thoughts, not just on the No California issue, but on kind of I want to drill down a little more into the substance of some of these new remote work policies that are evolving.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just California. I mean, there are some other states to think of, but I think it's also for many of our clients, it is the unintended consequence of being generous to their employees to have these complications. Depending on your footprint and how you're managing your benefits, that can also be complicated depending on networks and all kinds of other things. And it could impact your compensation planning as well over time. So I think there are a lot of nuances involved in managing outside of your area. Some of us know the word nexus, kind of where a tax hub or a registration hub is. It does become, talking a little bit about some of the hybrid work arrangements locally to the DC area, and you could put this across the country depending on where somebody's headquartered. The conversation is coming up. DC has a very formal definition of being a DC employee, means you were in the district physically 50% of the time or more, and that can impact some of your taxes, some of your benefits within DC. For organizations that are looking at maybe 2 days on site and 3 days at home, that might mean that they have employees that are now Virginia employees that previously were DC based employees. That's not a bad thing. It's just something to be aware of and think about. But it is that unintended consequence, and it's one of those conversations where you need to talk with your finance team, talk with your attorneys, make sure that your labor laws are up to date and your handbooks and all those things as well, so that you're prepared for some of that. It's not insurmountable, just means you might need to have a couple extra checklists to go through to accommodate some of that.
Yeah, and we have seen some employers in this DC metro area purposely structuring their policies so that certain employees are not covered by the DC employment laws, which are more generous to employees than, for instance, in Virginia, as you know, things like paid leave law and whatnot, that exists in DC and not in Virginia. So having employees only coming into the office 2 days a week, less than 50% of the time, can be helpful. Yep. So Carrie, following on that, what are some of the, we know that there's a lot of pressure from a lot of employees to be able to continue to remote work. Like Sarah said, a lot of folks have gotten to really enjoy it. I think we're all, at our homes right now doing this webinar. We've all been working from home for the last year plus. And a lot of staff, they really enjoy it. But I hear from a lot of CEOs and a lot of senior management that they are ready to get their staff back into the office, and there are benefits of being back into the office. There are drawbacks of being out of the office. I've heard from a number of CEOs saying they don't feel they're getting maximum productivity out of their employees. You're not getting the collegiality that you get from being in the office. So Carrie, from your perspective, what are some of the benefits from requiring employees to return to the office, and how do you motivate them and incentivize them to want to?
So I heard a really interesting analogy last week, and it was that people can choose to worship wherever at any time. But there's a reason why people attend church. It's because there's that feeling of community and shared purpose, that energy associated with it. And I would say that that same thing can exist in an office if indeed that office is designed correctly. So it's interesting to me because from what I'm hearing, the C-levels are the ones that want to work remotely, because generally they've got, 4, 5, 6 different houses they can choose from. It's the millennials and the younger generation that are stuck either living in their parents' house or that have a small apartment or that have roommates that are really itching to get out. There's an ability, like one of the biggest benefits is the attract and retain. Right now, there's a huge, huge war for talent. And the only way you get the best people is if you have a brand, if you have an identity, and if you have a culture that's strong, and that it can be communicated through space. Our mantra has been for years and years and years in this industry, how can you leverage real estate to increase collaboration, to resonate your brand? And there's an opportunity to do it if indeed it is designed successfully. These younger generations, they need mentorship. If you want a career path, you've got to have face time with those C-levels or those executive levels for continuous improvement. And if they're not getting that, that's hard. One of the surveys that they're sending out now for employee engagement is, the question is, do you have at least one colleague you consider a good friend? And how do you make good friends over a screen? Some of my best friends and longest relationships I've met through work. And it's just a matter of having that opportunity to interact as one-offs, you know, around the proverbial water cooler. That is something that's missing for sure. So to me, those are the biggest drivers as it relates to getting people back to the office. I also think that there can be frustration as it relates to technological issues from the house. So you've got to make the workplace more attractive than working from your home. So you do that, as you mentioned, by incentivizing employees, you know, what kind of collaborative spaces are offered. People have been working from home, so they're looking for spaces that are comfortable, you know, there's more of an influence, I think, from a residential perspective on commercial design than there has ever been, because they want to feel safe, they want to feel secure, they want a feeling of wellness when they enter that space.
Have you seen a follow-up to that? Have you seen associations and nonprofits at all contemplating kind of, you're never going to turn into the Google or Facebook workplaces?
Mhm.
My daughter works in New York City, usually for a company called Verizon Media that has a very, you know, Facebook, Google type atmosphere, right? It's, you know, all sorts of, pool tables and games and free food, and, you know, it's just a very collegial environment, all sorts of fun shared spaces. And, you know, and they really do try to incentivize people, you know, especially millennials. Everyone seems to love free food and drink and everything like that. And, you know, that's an incentive to get people back into the office and to have some fun times together with their colleagues. Are you seeing associations and nonprofits at all contemplate kind of reconfigurations to make their offices a little more like that?
So before this all hit, I work with a lot of associations, nonprofits, and they've always seemed to tend towards more of a private office environment than open office. You've got a lot of people that are highly educated, that are doing research, their heads down. As they were considering, you know, prior to 2019, looking at investing in real estate, a lot of them were having the conversation about open plan. And then you've got change management, major change management and messaging that needs to be associated with that, because especially now with the different generations that are within a workspace, there can be a lot of pushback on kind of hierarchical spaces, bigger private offices versus smaller, et cetera. When you start veering more towards open offices, open plan, and you're pulling people from private offices, you've got to give them an incentive as to why it's worth it. So yes, with that comes the collaborative spaces, 100%. And then the technology associated with collaborative spaces. So they're not just like a good place to sit down and chat. You can actually use the space. There is form, there is function, there is aesthetic.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Question from our audience for you, Sarah. And just off the top of your head, what states besides California that you work with tend to have more burdensome employment laws from kind of the employer's perspective?
Yeah, you know, West Coast, you've got right up the line, California, Oregon, and Washington State all have some particular laws and things to be aware of. Washington State with unemployment and particularly workers' comp. You come across the country and you know, New York and Connecticut have some specific laws. New York City itself gets into it. And then candidly, as you come down the coast to the DC area, DC and Maryland, and particularly Montgomery County even, you know, if you have enough presence in Montgomery County, you're going to fall into some laws and requirements there related to time off and some of their standards. I've obviously been reading a lot about return to work issues, and this morning Reuters had an article outlining that not just in California, but specifically Santa Clara County, there are some regulations related to vaccine management. So I think even within the scope of you know, the continuing COVID fallout, we'll continue to see localities and states have some different flavors as well. But in general, it's that West Coast up, and then you come across east to Connecticut, New York, and in this area for the most part.
Thank you. It's a great lead into to a topic that I wanted to get to sooner rather than later, which is kind of workplace policies with respect to vaccinations and masks and social distancing. And I'm going to start off with Rebecca. and then go to you, Sarah, and then I will likely have some thoughts. I do have some thoughts on this as well. So Rebecca, what trends are you seeing so far? And granted, a lot of nonprofit workplaces are not reopened, or at least not fully reopened yet. But I know, because I get consulted every day from clients, that my clients are thinking about this and working up their policies. I was actually working with one yesterday and today, a large employer in the DC area, on a survey they're going to do of their members. And you have to be very careful from a legal perspective, even what questions you ask, even in an anonymous survey, and how you phrase them. But they're trying what I thought was, interesting, kind of a more proactive approach to try to get the employees' input, try to get their buy-in, and, try to listen to what they're saying, but also to get helpful intelligence about what employees' plans are on vaccinations. But are you seeing any trends so far in terms of workplace policies on vaccinations and mask mandates?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tough one, both from, the occupier, the people, being asked to go back, or the employees, versus the decision makers, right? I think from a decision-making perspective, if you're a CEO or, a stakeholder who's making those decisions, and your objective, which is a hard position to be in, you're kind of balancing the desire and necessity to keep employee safety, keep employee morale and engagement. You want to hear the voice of the employee. You're not disregarding what people are hearing or feeling or thinking. At the same time, you have an organization and association that has business that they have to take care of and things that you need to do. And so walking that fine line right now specifically, we find to be a challenging position to be in. But certainly from the employee perspective, we're seeing in a lot of our survey results, some people who, if people aren't vaccinated, they don't want to step foot in the office if it's not fully, and if they can't see proof of that. And then we see the opposite end of the spectrum, where they just want to be in, and they don't want to wear a mask, they don't want to socially distance. From a policy perspective, I would not say we're really seeing any of the nonprofits or groups that we're working with saying everyone has to go back and everyone has to be vaccinated and you have to show us proof. We're not really seeing anybody go to that end of the spectrum right now. We are seeing some organizations say things like, if you want to go to the office, you have to be vaccinated, but you have the flexibility to work from home. So they're keeping that flexibility, they're keeping employees engaged, and they're giving employees the option of where they want to go. For some organizations, we're seeing a kind of honor code system where they're saying, hey, we want you to be vaccinated. If you're not vaccinated, you have to mask up. If you are vaccinated, you don't have to, and they're doing it by honor system. And then we have a handful who are doing kind of an attestation type of thing, where they're asking people to sign or some type of declarative statement of some kind to acknowledge they're seeing the updated mask or vaccination policy. But then once that's through, they're kind of doing, again, the honor system. A lot of the reasoning behind some of that, and I'm sure, Sarah, and you can speak a lot more to this, when it comes to HIPAA and people actually submitting proof of vaccination, and then you really dip your toe into like medical records and how that gets saved and who can see it. Some people are trying to just avoid that altogether. And so they're instead just strongly encouraging or doing it kind of that honor system method.
That's great. And Sarah, I'm going to get to you in 1 second. Just a few comments from a legal perspective, because I get these questions every day. So I just want to kind of put this out there. Just the basic legal construct when it comes to this stuff. First off, it is permissible for nonprofit employers to mandate vaccinations as a precondition to returning to the office and to traveling for work or going on any work business outside of the office, so long as you make two exceptions. One, for those that have a medical condition that qualifies as a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act or a corresponding state law, meaning you have to make a reasonable accommodation for those that have that disability, so long as it doesn't pose an undue burden on the employer. And for most employers, a reasonable accommodation for most positions will allow them to continue to work remotely. That does not work, though, for all positions in nonprofit organizations. And then the other exception is for someone who has a sincerely held religious belief that prevents them from getting vaccinated. So in either case, if it prevents them from getting vaccinated because of the medical condition or a sincerely held religious belief, you have to make that reasonable accommodation to accommodate them. But otherwise, you can require vaccinations as a precondition. Now, most employers that are working up their policies in this regard in the nonprofit space so far seem to be taking an approach of, we will either encourage or mandate vaccinations with those two exceptions. But if you're not, if you don't fall into one of those two exceptions and you choose not to be vaccinated, then we're going to require you to wear masks and do social distancing and otherwise follow the OSHA guidance in this regard. And then in terms of asking for proof of vaccination, you can ask for proof of vaccination if you want to. If you have a mandatory vaccination policy, you can ask for proof. You should never ask any follow-up questions like, any other details about the medical history or anything else. You can ask for proof. We've been advising clients not to maintain that proof, like that, you have to show a copy of your CDC vaccination card to the HR director. They check a box, sign off that you've shown your proof, but not to maintain a copy of that. And you are permitted to do that. Now, not every employer is choosing to do that. Many are going on an honor system or a self-attestation. But if you wanted to, you certainly can do that. And then finally, the other legal principle to keep in mind is that to the extent that someone falls into those two exceptions with a medical condition or the sincerely held religious belief, to the extent, particularly in the former, that you ask questions about that, which you're allowed to ask certain questions. Under the ADA, it's really important that you keep that information separate from the personnel records and make sure it stays completely confidential. That's really important to do. And it's not a HIPAA issue, by the way. A lot of people think that, but most nonprofits are not covered by HIPAA, and they're not business associates under HIPAA. So they're not covered by it unless you're in a healthcare institution, for instance. Now some nonprofits certainly are. Most are not, but this mandate about medical information confidentiality comes from the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, Sarah, with that as kind of legal background, can you talk a little bit about these same issues, kind of trends you're seeing, recommendations that you have, anything that I missed, certainly anything that you disagree with? This is all very much work in progress.
Yeah, so the interesting trend for me is some of the organizations that I work with that are more health focused. They were ready to go back once they knew people had vaccines. Some of them were even supporting vaccine clinics or involved in some of the rollout. So they had a good feel for what their staff were doing, and the culture in their organization was very pro-vaccine. So they've been a little more, downright compared to other groups, more aggressive about opening the doors back up. And it's typically guests that are coming in, or if they have new hires or interns, they're using that attestation approach of, if you've been vaccinated, we follow the local guidelines, and if you have not, here's your mask if you need a replacement. I think when the groups that I'm working with that are less aligned or connected with healthcare, there's more questions, and that kind of makes sense. They're working in different specialty areas, and so their familiarity with some of the nuances are a little different. But groups are definitely struggling. When I've done surveys with a couple of groups, and for the most part, employees are either happy to say whether they've had a vaccine or not, or in the surveys where it's, is there anything else you want to tell us box, they're saying, yes, I'm vaccinated, I'm ready to come back. So the appetite, I think, around our area is for opening those doors and coming back. But I do think people need to be really thoughtful of those people who have complications. I had a chance to talk with one employee. She and her husband are vaccinated. They have a child who cannot be vaccinated due to age and the child's health condition. So they still have to maintain a high level of safety within their family. So that employee may be able to return in theory, but for the health of their younger child, they're going to be very reluctant to. And I think there's some people that hit those edges, and those are sensitive conversations to have. And it's the kind of thing where, working with executives or working with leadership and organizations, it's walking through that information in those conversations to help make those decisions and make things happen appropriately for each individual across the organization. But, the appetite is for a lot of people to get back. I will echo a lot of what Carrie said earlier. A lot of the younger employees that have been living in isolation more so than, some of us who have families or maybe a little more space in our homes, it's been a real tough year, and they are ready to get back to a workplace or, get out of the four walls they've been stuck in. So I think those people are looking for it, and hopefully the vaccine rates will continue to raise across the board to make it safe.
Well, but Sarah, beyond that, though, I've definitely seen the appetite to get back. And I've also seen another trend is that a lot of employees are lower level, mid-level employees are pushing senior management
Yeah.
to mandate vaccinations because they want to go back and feel like it's a safe environment. It's an interesting phenomenon that I didn't really predict early on, this groundswell for, for mandatory vaccination. So can you
Yeah.
the kind of vaccine mandates in the workplace? Obviously, we know the two exceptions I talked about, but beyond that, what are you seeing? Do you have recommendations in this regard?
Yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of mandates, and I think it depends on the environment. And I think if, it goes back to space and so forth. The organizations that I'm working with, their goal is to be a little, it's not softer, but their approach to it's a little more gentle. They're willing to accept that the employees have the vaccines and they're returning. I don't think the appetite is to mandate things and have to then enforce some of these other follow-on pieces. I think some of it is also having the conversations to the best of an organization's ability. With one group I went through, we did small group conversations about what reopening might look like and the concerns people had. And as people talk through those, it was good to get that pulse and to understand where people had concerns. And a lot of it was not necessarily their office suite specifically, but it was things like getting to the office. It was getting around the building. And that was where a little more concern was coming up. So I have not come across a huge upswell on the mandate requirement, but I have heard a lot of concerns about safety getting to work and what it looks like once you get inside your own suite, what that space looks like.
Yeah, and I've seen that same trend. There seems to be this rolling, kind of gradual reopening of a lot of offices, making it optional, things like that, trying to get everyone used to it.
Exactly.
But a number of employers are contemplating a full-on return, after Labor Day or later. But and at that point, I think that's when you're going to see more of the, these questions bubble up about vaccine mandates. Another interesting issue that came up recently with a client of ours. Client is not going to have a vaccine mandate. They are going to encourage their staff to be vaccinated, but they are going to say, and they're not going to require any proof of anything, but they're going to say, if you're not fully vaccinated, then you need to wear a mask if you're going to come into the office and properly socially distance. And they got, HR got an email from an employee who said for medical reasons, she's not able to get a vaccine for a certain period of time. And she's really worried about being the only one in the office, that's wearing a mask and is going to be kind of singled out, ridiculed, bullied. And so they came to me to ask my thoughts on it. And, first thing, and I'm sure you definitely agree with this, is that you always want to create an environment, a culture in your organization where no one is ever feeling, bullied, ridiculed, or things like that. And that actually can create legal risk for the organization as well. If that's the case, but it's just for employee morale and so many other reasons, you certainly never want to do that. So, but I did say legally, no one has a right to, even if they, granted, if it's a medical condition that qualifies under the ADA, then the employer has to make a reasonable accommodation, which might be allowing them to work from home. But if they want to come into the office, they can't get vaccinated, but they are going to wear a mask. They don't have a legal right to not be the only person wearing a mask. And that doesn't create any legal rights for them. And the employer could mandate that if they want. But what I did encourage them to do is to do proper training, of all of your staff, at least reminders about, look, these are difficult times. And some people, many of us are vaccinated, but there are going to be some who are not. And are you seeing any best practices in terms of training and whatnot in that regard?
I'm not seeing best practices on it. I think it's a really important thing to do. And I think there's a great opportunity I'm a huge advocate of training throughout the year, managers and so forth on a lot of topics. And I think this is an opportunity for organizations to look at some different dimensions of training. Some of it's safety, basic, I'll call it housekeeping kind of thing. Some of it is for managers and how to navigate conversations or issues that might come up with employees. But I think if there is a chance to do some discussion about safety within your office, this is just an opportunity, not a problem for people. They should take advantage of having that time to talk about safety in the workplace and health in the workplace. And I think if those conversations become regular, then it becomes easier to bridge some of these things. It's not a crisis reaction anymore if you have a regular program of walking through difficult employee issues, whether they're emergent or long-term. But I am not seeing a huge groundswell of training with the groups that I deal with. So,
I mean, it's also new too. All right, we have one question from the audience on this, and then apologies to Rebecca and Carrie. We'll get back to you guys. I knew we were going to spend a good amount of time on this issue, and it's one that everyone's curious about. So here's the question. Although we're talking about a return to the office for existing employees, what's your best advice for new hires who are going to join the team? Can we ask new hires if they are vaccinated, but if they're not and they don't get hired, can they claim that they were somehow discriminated against? Should we avoid asking this question during the interview process, or just declare if you're not vaccinated, you need to wear a mask? Let me take a first shot at this. I made this reference earlier. You need to apply your vaccination and mask mandate policies on a consistent and objective basis. It doesn't mean that that has to apply equally to every person. There may be some departments that lend themselves to remote work, for instance, and some that don't. And you can have variances in your remote work policies in that regard and things like that. But it's always important in every employment policy, and Sarah knows as well, to do things on a consistent and objective basis, so that you don't get a claim from someone that says, no, the real reason that you didn't hire me or you fired me or you demoted me or didn't promote me is because of my XYZ protected characteristic, not because of my vaccination status. Now, vaccination status is not a protected characteristic, but like so many other things, it could be used as a ground for saying that the real reason was because of their race or their ethnicity, their age or their gender or whatnot. And so it is very important that you do things consistently. But if you have a mandatory vaccination policy, or if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask. If you're not vaccinated, you do. And again, with the usual accommodations that we talked about, you can tell that to a new employee. And if they choose, because they don't, believe in vaccinations, they don't want to they're scared of it, whatever the case might be, then, if they choose to not move forward, that's okay. I would not recommend, though, ever making a decision to not hire someone based on, their statement that they're not vaccinated and they don't plan to. Any other thoughts on that, Sarah?
No, I mean, I completely agree with you. There have been a couple of articles recently from some of the airlines, I think, that have been going through processes of evaluating this for their hiring. But I would also say treating your new hires differently or applying a different standard. If you do end up hiring these people, what an awful way to bring them in some sort of different path or space than the rest of the team. If you're changing your practices, that's good. Practices evolve over time, but to treat them differently, I think that would just create, I don't know, it's a bad step to take at the beginning of a relationship.
All right, Carrie, back to you. So, we've talked a lot about kind of hybrid work options, which may be the permanent reality for many, if not most nonprofits. For sure, we'll have to see. I mean, not that many nonprofits didn't have, hybrid and remote work policies before. Many did, but things have now advanced to a whole different level, and probably will stay that way for a lot of employers. But post pandemic, in terms of remote and hybrid kind of work options, any suggestions on how that experience can be optimized for the employees? How to really make it work, whether it's permanent, full-time remote, whether it's hybrid? Any suggestions that you've seen from your perspective?
Sure. I think Rebecca mentioned a lot of it is going to be how you deploy technology. So if people are coming back and they're in a hybrid environment, let's say they're 3 days a week, how are they going to know where they're going and where their colleagues are? So you look at technology as it relates to room reservation systems and just mapping throughout so that there isn't a sense of being lost within the space or it being unfamiliar. As it relates to remote workers, a lot of times what larger organizations do is they look at their standards. So if they have a standard task chair, a standard height adjustable table, standard monitor arm, things that are ergonomic, a lot of people are sitting in dining room chairs, and that's just not good for you. So they're actually creating kind of an a la carte list of what do you need, or if you were to pick one of these items, and then pay for that, just because it does increase productivity. And it also makes employees feel valued, that there's an investment there. So those would be the two largest things, I think, as it relates to just optimizing the experience.
Thank you. Excellent. Rebecca, kind of following on that, what are some of the hybrid models that you see some of your clients considering? And kind of companion question, what do you think kind of the workplace of the future of the next 5 years in the nonprofit and association space is going to look like compared to what it did in the past?
I mean, I think, I guess taking the latter part of your question first, I think the workplace of the future, especially in the nonprofit side, a lot of it to me goes back to where you were kind of pre-COVID. So the opposite extreme example I'll give you is a tech company, like the Google example, the Facebook companies that were at kind of the cutting edge of workplace and the dynamic of how people work together in collaboration pre-COVID. There's not necessarily like a huge gap or place for them to go now. They already were deploying a lot of the things that we're talking about. They may look to see how they can be more efficient. They're looking at how to get people returning. Maybe there's some type of a hybrid element, but I think the workplace of the future question for that type of an organization is a lot different when we're talking about nonprofits and other associations and organizations. I think what we're going to continue to see as trends, a lot of what Carrie was saying is a lot of attention and time spent on flexibility within the workplace, not just in how you look at your hybrid or your workforce, but flexibility in how your office is actually set up and designed, and the types of spaces and the dynamic furniture that you have, as an example. The other thing I think we'll continue to see, to the best of, an organization's capabilities, are looking at the amenities program. When we speak about recruitment and retention of employees and talent and that war for talent, a lot of that ties back to an association's amenities program, and people are looking at what all these different places have to offer and kind of choosing the best from their perspective. And so I think from a workplace perspective, amenities will be another area we continue to see really aggressively pushed from a design and a workplace dynamic perspective. To the hybrid question and what we're seeing or what are the different models, I think we're seeing it range from either a lot of choice, and I say the word power, I don't really mean it in that context, but a lot of the decision being left in the hands of employees, where a lot of organizations are saying, you can decide when you're coming in, you can make that decision. Yes, here's technology to book your seat, or you'll tell us when you think you're coming in, but there are some, organizations who are looking at that extreme where they're letting employees dictate a lot of that. I think the smartest, or not the smartest, but the path we're seeing with the most success right now is a little bit of a combination of, you want employees to be able to have some control and some say, and that's what they're looking for. But from a business perspective and a space perspective, you want to be able to manage who's in the office, when they're there, where they're sitting, so you have a little bit of control over that traffic flow. And certainly if there are still capacity restrictions and some social distancing for unvaccinated people, that you're able to control a little bit of that flow. So we're seeing a lot more towards people coming in on specific days, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you're in, Tuesday, Wednesday, you're not, or shared spaces with a worked out schedule or something like that.
That's excellent. Thank you. We do have a question that you kind of just referenced in your answer, which is, for vaccinated employees, is a 6-foot social distancing still required? And the short answer is, first off, you always have to look at what the state and city and or county, and we talked about counties too, don't forget about counties like Montgomery County, certain counties that have stricter regulations than even the state. You always have to look at what mandates are coming from the state and city and county, and those things are changing on a very regular basis, and will continue to evolve. So you always have to look there. In terms of federal guidance, for the most part, there's no mandates. There's just guidance so far there's 3 main agencies to look at. The EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. Those are the 3. They're kind of working in part in tandem. OSHA is the one that most specifically regulates kind of workplace conditions, while EEOC, guards against discrimination and other workplace practices. But CDC also has commented on this stuff. So you also want to look to all of that guidance. But so far, what they are saying is that if you have fully vaccinated employees, 2 weeks after the final shot, that you do not need to require masks or social distancing for those employees, but for non-vaccinated employees, you should. And now that's not binding, it's guidance, but from a kind of tort liability perspective, because that is the guidance, if you were to fail to follow that guidance for non-vaccinated employees and some bad things happen and create some harm to some of the employees, you could be potentially liable for not following kind of basically the standard of care that's being set forth by those federal agencies. That guidance is still going to likely change, but if you want to say, if you are fully vaccinated, even if it's just a self-attestation, that you do not have to wear a mask and you do not have to socially distance, that is okay from a legal perspective. Sarah, we're almost out of time here, but are you seeing any, and I know all this is new, I'm asking you questions about things that really probably won't take effect and be put into place for a number of months, but are you seeing any talk about kind of changes in HR policies, as a result of what we're seeing, both through the COVID and remote work issues, but also in terms of recruitment and retention, and the employee shortage that we're seeing across the country, things like unlimited leave banks and unlimited remote work options. And tell us a little bit about what you're seeing, trends, opportunities.
Yeah, I think in the past year, one of the things that was interesting is a lot of the groups that I work with or my colleagues work with started requiring people to take some of their leave during the year. There was a lot of burnout, and that's kind of the flip side of working from home. It never turns off. And so a lot of groups have looked at their leave. They've looked at holiday schedules. More groups are starting to create breaks, winter breaks, summer breaks, that kind of thing seems to be a trend as in the leave world. Evaluating telecommuting policies, because we've kind of been doing it for the last year, but maybe it's time to tighten things back up, talk about safety at home, core work hours, those kinds of things seem to be something that is coming up quite a bit. And I do think, again, as people are looking around and saying, gosh, I have employees in North Carolina now, or, choose your states, it is time to look at handbooks. It is time to look at your overall policies and how groups are communicating. And the other one that I'm seeing, which is less a policy issue and more of a practice thing, is groups looking at how they are managing meetings. How do they use their technology tools? What are their standards for meetings with internal and external staff? Knowing that as an organization opens up a headquarters, maybe we always assume that somebody will be remote. So we always make sure there's a remote option to dial in. Some of those practices are changing as well. But yeah, the leave thing has probably been the biggest item on the policy docket this past year.
That's what I'm seeing too. And real quick on the employee handbook, I'm gonna ask each of you to, in about 30 to 60 seconds, kind of give me any final thoughts and words of wisdom for our audience today. But Sarah, on the employee handbook issue, I presume you would agree that if you're an employer that now has employees working in states that they were not previously principally working, they were in the office or whatnot, that it's critically important to update and revise your employee handbook, to have specific provisions that apply to the employees in those states. But then also, a lot of employers don't want to have different policies for different staff. So sometimes it ends up resulting in a lowest common denominator that if you have a few employees in some state that has more generous benefits, leave or otherwise paid leave, that they put it in, across the board for all staff. Any quick comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's depending on the size of the organization, that impact can make sense, the common denominator. But for some groups, an addendum is an effective tool to keep you covered until you do a big revision. They can be 1 or 2 pages. They don't have to be terrible. And that's that training opportunity with a manager of, hey, things are a little different over here. But for larger groups, I think that common denominator will become the path of least resistance for a large group.
Yeah, just don't forget to do it. If you have employees working most of the time out of one state, they are covered by those laws, and your handbook needs to reflect that.
Yeah.
Carrie, any final thoughts, words of wisdom, tips, suggestions for our group?
Oh, Jeff, I have so many. Just kidding. So I would just say, again, like the point I would drive home is make sure that as you move forward, you're creating space that's quote unquote agile. It's a catchphrase, whatever, but you tend to know how you need the space to function the longer you're in it. and what the needs are, what the weaknesses are, the longer you're in it. So if you plan accordingly up front, then you have the ability to address those things in the future. And then you're actually, I mean, real estate's expensive. So you've got to be able to make sure that you've got the most bang for your buck throughout that lease period.
And for those of you that were in our last webinar, I think a month ago or so, we focused on all those real estate issues. Rebecca, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, from a change management perspective, don't be afraid to be transparent with your employees. If, you know, there's a job that requires them to be in the office, don't try and pretend that's not what the situation is. I think we're seeing far more effective change management programs and policies with associations that are being direct and transparent, giving people time to adjust and have a long runway to get to where they want them to be. You know, and then the other thing that I would say is, you know, I think everyone's looking for this silver bullet answer to what to do right now and how to do it. And everyone's in the same boat. Everyone's just trying to figure it out as they go along. And certainly, I think, obviously, you know, you want to consult experts where it's needed, but, you know, the trends are kind of all over the map. So don't be concerned that you're not, you know, doing what everyone else is. It's really a matter of finding what the right path is for your, you know, organization specifically.
Yeah, I was talking to a HR director at a pretty decent sized nonprofit organization, client of ours, and she was, you know, the nonprofit culture is very different than for-profit culture, and I think you guys might have seen the comment from, I think it was the Morgan Stanley CEO this week, who said, you know, he was interviewed and he said, basically, we expect all employees to be back in the office after Labor Day, kind of, or else, and you're not going to be viewed favorably if not. And she was kind of admiring that approach and wish that, you know, the nonprofit world had more of that approach. Some people feel that way. In the nonprofit world, it's generally not that way. I do know a lot of nonprofit and association CEOs that probably do feel that way. But you need to, like you just said, you need to find the approach that works, not only obviously from a legal perspective, but from an HR and employee relations and recruitment and retention and all of these other perspectives. I have two quick questions here, and then I'm going to go to you, Sarah, actually, on one of these. What's the best approach to address unvaccinated employees whose jobs require them to travel? I think the short answer is for the reasons that I explained earlier, that if someone's unvaccinated, we got to follow the prevailing guidance, which is you got to wear the mask and you got to socially distance and all that. And what that applies in the office, that applies when they're traveling. And of course, we're not dealing with the reasonable accommodations required for someone with a medical disability or sincerely held religious belief. And I think there's just no choice in that. And we have another question, and kind of for you, Sarah. We have a number of staff who have gone to remote locations for several weeks or months to work. I think we all know people like that, right? Go to warm weather climates, you know, for a few months in the wintertime or whatnot, if you're in the East Coast or whatnot. Is there anything we as the employer should be concerned about in allowing staff to continue to do this in the future? And let's presume that if folks are doing this, it's not for a majority of the year. So it's not like that's going to create a nexus and that's a new place of employment.
Yeah. I mean, if it's a short spin, you've got a month or two, maybe, things to think about. If they are out of your footprint or out of their area, they're still working and they still need to meet core hours. They still need to be available. You know, something we really hadn't touched on, although within the scope of technology, be aware that if they are out of the area, ensure that they understand they need to have secure Wi-Fi or other connections. Working at the local Starbucks is not good for your data. Impress upon them the need to make sure that their work product is treated like your work product and they're choosing the best possible location. And just make sure that they understand that all of the rules that apply when they're in the office or working from their home location convey to a remote location if that's where they're working for a period of time. And you're right, it's something that I think is going to become kind of par for the course for people to do that more often. And it's workable as long as everybody knows what's on that checklist.
Great. Any other final thoughts, Sarah?
Yeah, the only other thing I'll say is, you know, we talked about change management. We all kind of became experts last year, but there's a lot of stressors for people coming back. So just be aware that, there's an emotional component to this for people still. We just spent a year and a half being told to be cautious and scared of everything. And now we're saying it's okay. And some of your employees are going to need a little extra time on that. I think, Rebecca talked about that, giving a long runway for people to kind of come back in. So just keep that humane part of the equation in your headspace as you make all these decisions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, Rebecca, Carrie, for a terrific job today. We actually were able to cover a lot of ground, a ton of ground, I think, in the last 60 minutes. And you guys were terrific, gave some really solid practical advice in what is a very challenging and difficult environment for everyone. So thank you to you guys. Thanks to Jordan and Bernstein for hosting this, and the Nonprofit Advisory Board for permitting us to do this. I hope you all got a lot out of it, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.